This is Eward Driehuis from a snowy Oslo, across the street from the Nordic financial CERT. In a minute, I'm going to speak to Morten Tandle. He's the general manager and in charge of building and leading the organization for over 10 years since it was NFCert and evolving into NFCert. He knows about sharing and bringing different financials and different nations together. I'm excited to speak to him in another episode of Fusion Fireside. How long have we known each other, Morten?
Time flies.
Yeah.
Back to the days of sort of 29, 10, 11, 12, and internet banking Trojans, which was sort of a one start.
Yeah. I remember a trip I made to Iceland.
Oh yeah.
It was an event. The host was Håkon Akerlund.
Yeah.
And
that sounds familiar.
And
probably, I think at that time it was something done by the Finance Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and so on. They had a Nordic e-banking security summit for a few years, from I think 2010 until 15, 16.
Yeah.
So they managed at least one round.
Yeah.
And that was good. That was the early beginning of tech-supported fraud, I guess. And stealing money from digital banking.
It was, wasn't it? Because back then it was quite a novelty that now suddenly all this malware stuff is being used to defraud customers of banks.
Yep.
Wasn't it?
It was. I think so in 2007 or 8, I worked in a bank. And then we had our first run-in and experience with somebody stealing money from customers through the internet bank with malware on the customer's unit or device. So that was unpleasant, I think, for the banks. They were not. It was a risk. It's not like they weren't expecting it, but you always do. When it actually happens, I think it generates a response. So,
I think they all knew that it was a possibility, but if you don't see it happening, it's how you.
And they had at that time, I think they had done internet banking for at least 10 years already, so they felt that they had this down, and it was starting to be mature. And then all of a sudden there was a small shock.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you remember out of those days? Are there still things that you learned back then that you still use today in your day-to-day work?
Probably. When at that time I was in IT security, and that was, I think, at that time in 2008, that was still a slight struggle. It was still. You had to argue with the business and you had to fight to do security. Less so probably in banks than in other parts of society, but it was still there. But then this was actually sort of in the core business of the bank.
Yeah.
And so then, I actually learned quite a lot about banks, about payments. And how that works, and about risk. And that's still relevant and useful today.
So interesting. So you say that in some way the fraud that was suddenly happening back then was some kind of a catalyst also in IT security?
It made a set of threats more real. It actually made concrete examples of someone stealing money from the internet bank, which in that way, with technically supported, hadn't happened before. So it made, and I think they had the risk. They knew that it was a risk, but then dealing with it was a challenge, and it required the organization to work together. It was not, so the business needed the tech people to be in the incident response, and the tech people needed to learn the business sufficiently to actually do something sensible. And there were almost silos, so there was, I think, learnings on both sides.
So how back then, because obviously you're the general manager of NFCert, right? So obviously you're all about collaboration right now. So was there already back in those days, did you see that there was a lack of collaboration that urged you to start this?
Yes, to a certain degree. I think I think the summits that we talked about was one response, where the Nordic banking associations came together and to share and collaborate on internet banking fraud. And so that was something that wasn't there before and was missing. I think I'm like, yes, of course, what we do is collaboration and sharing. So that is really what I'm all about. I do think that started something. And we saw, but I think on the fraud side, I think fraud for a bank is part of the business. It's 1,000 years old, or maybe, 250 years old, maybe for banks. So that part is not new, but then the transformation of the banks into being tech-based, and then to understand also the interplay between fraud and technology, I think that was new to them. And then having forums to share, I did see, and it was, so the first attacks, for instance, where the bank that I worked in was attacked, but there was also another large bank that was attacked. And we found each other pretty quickly, informally, and then shared and collaborated. And that was really useful. And we were quite different, but then having those two perspectives meet and share was actually quite useful for both of us. The large banks had sort of larger organizational distances. They had a different outsourcing setting. And I think outsourcing doesn't have to be, but it often creates even larger organizational differences or distances. And so they struggled to find some of the information that our team could find, because we had a smaller team, was more integrated. And so the tech part was easier to, and so we did that really quickly. But then, so we both had things to share and learn, and that was it was a good spiral, and it served us both well, I think. And for me, that was one of the beginnings to really enjoying the collaboration part that I'm now then still doing. Probably, 15 years later?
50 years now. So how did you, because explain to me how you went from the bank to, did you start NFCert, or did you take it over? What?
So I left the bank, I went into consulting. So I was there for a couple of years. And then the banks decided to start a NFCert. And then I was lucky enough to get hired I was employee number 1. And so I got to do it. I got to build it, and yeah. So that was my way in. So I didn't actually, it wasn't my idea, and I wasn't part of the decision making of let's do this. But I was lucky enough to then get tapped to actually execute on the idea.
That's amazing. And now we're 15 years later.
Well, this is 10 years later.
Right, 10 years later, yeah. Right, yeah. And 10 years later, the organization, did it change name, or did it become a different organization as well, from NFCert to NFCert?
Yes, so we did have, the Norwegian banks and insurance companies started NFCert Norge in 2013, actually. And then in 2017, the Nordic banks came together and saw they wanted this. They looked at, and they could start then national NFCerts in each country, but they wanted to have a Nordic function for many reasons. The Nordics is one region. The Nordic financial infrastructure is getting more integrated, and so you don't necessarily have that per country, and they wanted the Nordic level, and so they started that. But then they could have done that in different ways, but they ended up agreeing with then the Norwegian banks and NFCert Norway to merge those. And so the Nordic Financial Cert that we are now was built on NFCert and then transformed into a Nordic association.
Right.
That's what happens. And that happened we had some large Nordic players, of course, who were the drivers of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how broad is your coverage right now? How many members do you have, or let's say is everyone a member or almost everyone?
Oh, so to be a member with us, you have to have a license to do you have to deliver licensed financial services in the Nordics. I haven't, so my impression is that there are a few thousand organizations that have those type of licenses.
Right.
We have 240 members.
Wow.
So we have we have a big potential.
Yeah.
Still, we do have, and we have critical financial infrastructure as members. Actually, last year, or was it the year before, we have all 5 central banks, and they play one role. They don't do retail payments, but they are the central clearing for their currency. And most of the Nordic countries are not euro countries. We have our small kroner in each different country that has their own infrastructure. So we do have a lot of the large players, banks, insurance companies, pension companies, securities deposits companies, and then the central banks. But there's room for more. Yeah.
That's amazing. But that must mean that pretty much nothing happens in the entirety of the 5 countries, the 5 main countries in the Nordics, that you don't know.
If it's important enough, maybe. Yeah. So on the fraud side, we do have a good visibility. And on the cyber side, we also do have a good visibility. Of course, on the fraud side, it's busy. Always a lot of fraud. Never truly quiet. On the cyber side, it actually varies, and it can be, even though, so you have sort of the background noise of that makes people say that we get attacked every second, every day.
Right.
That's always there. But the number of real attacks that actually gets people's attention and that we should know about, they are much rarer. And so I do think that we, or at least someone on our team, are aware when those things happen. That is one of the functions that we fill, to have the situational pictures within our membership across the Nordics. And then we also do have a part where we collaborate with government and others. And so we can share the Nordic situational picture in the financial sector with other sectors in the Nordics and outside internationally. And then, of course, taking the situational picture from there back to our Nordic members. That is one of the things we do. And then that does give us a good insight in what's happening.
Yeah, I can imagine. So go back step is, I'm interested in learning, how do you have functions that are focusing on cybersecurity and functions that focus on fraud? Or how does that work? How do you see the division of attention within your organization between those?
So our organization is integrated, but in our members, in a typical bank, these are actually quite differently organized. The cyber is typically in IT, part of IT, while fraud is somewhere in the business because it affects their customers. And so that's, so with us, it's one integrated team. With our members, it's different people who come and collaborate. We do sometimes, I think in most of our members, so if it's very technical fraud, if it's mobile malware, so one of your favorite subjects maybe, then of course I think when they need the deep technical competence, that is probably in the cyber organization. It's not in the payments business, so then they also collaborate internally. And I don't think they usually don't have too many sort of deep technical specialists on cyber or whatever you want to call it in the payment fraud side. So then we also do see an integration in our members. But then for the most part, what we do is, there's different people that come and share and collaborate. And who there, of course, I mean, especially our large members, they do specialize. And so then it's different people showing up and doing the job.
Yeah.
And it is, to oversimplify, I mean, the people in the banks who work with fraud, they work with customers, accounts, transactions. The people on the cyber side, they work with very technical things, malware, IP addresses, and they are actually quite different.
Yeah. So what happens if there's one of those, especially back in the days when fraud attacks were leveraged by malware as well? Suddenly you need that technical capability to be feeding into the fraud departments as well.
Yeah.
But is that a challenge that you see in your members?
Probably, but it's I think our members have gotten quite tech savvy in payments. I think we're all. So basically all payments are digital, and it's a nuanced picture. I saw somewhere someone who handles cash was saying that the amount of cash and cash transactions are still increasing, but as if I remember, as part of the total amount of payments. So it's decreasing.
Right, exactly.
We're, I think in the Nordic countries, we're somewhere between 95 and 98% cashless.
Yeah.
And that's also, of course, I mean, if you count in sort of moving money, so the large transaction, they're of course cashless, and with that perspective, then cash is hard to see. But then there is a part of society that still transacts in cash, but I think it's getting hard.
Yeah.
Actually. So yeah, and that does affect, of course. So then I think the banks and the payments people, they're actually they're getting more tech savvy, but it's one thing to be tech savvy and know about payments. It's another thing to be sort of deeply understanding operating systems, malware, reversing these tricks.
Yeah.
That is its own competence.
Yeah. So how would you respond if I said that I talk to people from across the globe, and from several continents really, people have said to me, hey, listen, Eward, we consider the Nordics to be an example of how you build fraud resilience across an entire industry. Is there truth in that as far as you're concerned? Or do you think, hey, listen, we're just bunch of banks doing our best? And
really good question. So I think we might be in some cases, and because we're forced to, and because we, like I said, when our economy, or when we change to be 97, 98% digital, that changes society. It makes, so if fraud and crime can't deal in cash anymore, they go somewhere else, and they, of course, as usual, they go the path of least resistance, and so they go where people are, and so we do get maybe earlier than the countries that are still at 50% cash, and we have those not too far away. So then the world is very different, but I think we also have a lot to learn. I think there is something in the Nordics. I think we want things to be right. That's sort of part of the culture. Another thing, a way to say that is that we have a low sort of fraud acceptance. And so and I think that's actually a strength. So we don't want to live with a high fraud level. Then we want to do what it takes to do something about it. But my impression now, I think we have a similar situation all across Europe. The digital payments fraud and other financial crime is growing. and we're part of that society, and I'm not sure if we're leading the way there. I think we also look at our peers, neighbors, and try to figure out how can we make this work for us. Yeah, so we do have some strengths. One is, so I think there's a high trust in society. That's a superpower sometimes because it can be extremely efficient. But of course, it's also when you have a society with high trust, that can also be exploited. So everything has the flip side of the coin. But I think in digitization, we're getting super helped by this high trust. And so companies, banks, others are changing their services and their business, and it's being accepted and utilized by society. So that's fantastic. But of course, the other side of that is that then there's criminals that see opportunities in this high trust. And so we have to deal with that as well. And I think we are. But yeah, it's a way to go. Luckily, I think often if you want to do sort of reduce fraud and have more control, that is something that technology can help with. So that seems to be the path that we're on.
And how has I know that, for example, 10 years ago, we were always talking about bank ID. Like bank ID being the uniquely Nordic technology that is, well, we also allowing the banks to use a shared infrastructure for all kinds of things. Does that play a role?
So I think that digital IDs in the Nordic countries play a key role. And if you see, and just for me as a consumer, so with my one bank ID, I can live my digital life. And if you're a service provider, if you sell, I don't know, anything that needs credit checking, and you need to know, and if you need to onboard customers and you have a know your customer part, bank ID can be super efficient. So if I want to change a product, if I want to change the services that I buy, financial services, insurances, even my home loan, those kinds of things, I can do that at home at night with my bank ID. And it takes minutes to an hour instead of days and weeks and talking to people and paper. And so the strong digital ID, I think, is key. Of course, again, flip sides. So then you have, every or almost every citizen has a bank ID. And so if a criminal can hijack this bank ID, it's extremely useful. You can do a lot with it. And then finding the balance, that's actually, that's still being worked on. And there's important work, I think, happening now. Also, collaboration with the government and the banking association, financial organizations on how to protect maybe weaker groups in society, elderly and others, in a world where everything's easy if you can be digital, but then it's also can be easy to exploit. And so then finding a way to have, to keep the value of having this easy, but making it sufficiently secure.
Yeah, exactly. So finding that balance is key, especially in a high trust society such as the countries in the Nordics. Yeah, that is amazing. And so,
I think the EU has seen that sort of, it can be a driver for digitization. And so my impression now is that EU is standardizing and that there will be digital ideas of some form in most EU countries. And I'm actually not, I don't I'm curious. There are some of the countries that have traditions that make it harder, like Germany, I think, and I guess UK, but they're not part of the EU anymore.
Yeah.
but because there's the privacy versus potential for government control, and we're somewhere on a range, and of course the full digitization and the one digital ID per person gives potential for government control.
Yeah, and there's various initiatives on that level as well. You're right, like the EIDAS, for example, and
that's good. So that's the what do you call it? Standardization and the ability. So if you were to sort of want to live and work in Oslo, or just come here for a while for some reason, I think it can be. So if you don't get the bank ID, then you're back in the sort of difficult. And it's probably even more difficult because now everyone local has bank ID and does it easy. And so you have to do the exception route, potentially even with paper. And so with EIDAS, there's a standardization. And ideally, so if the Netherlands has a national ID, or some kind of ID that you could bring, you could actually bring that in here and use it. It's the potential of that one, but that's still maturing, I think.
Yeah. Well, so I reckon Europe should look at the Nordics, because you guys have been doing this with bank ID in a sense for years already. So and you've learned a bunch of lessons.
But we don't have a Nordic bank ID. So that's per country. So there's a Norwegian bank ID, there's a Swedish bank ID, there's now a Danish MIT ID. Finland actually has multiple solutions, which might actually be starting to come also in Sweden, for instance. And then Iceland has an ID that I don't remember the name of right now. So and we do have so in the Nordics is one region. There's actually quite a bit of collaboration, and there are some agreements that have supposed to make it easy to work and live in the region. So if you're a Norwegian taking a job in Sweden, that should be easy. If you're a Swede working in Denmark, that should be easy. But the digitization has actually erected some barriers to that government is now working to lower again.
So what are some trends onto the threats that you are seeing right now? Is it romance fraud like in the rest of the world? What are you seeing? What are your members dealing with?
So I think in all the Nordic societies and basically also in the rest of the EU, my understanding, I think the frauds that have the most success on the fraud side or the most impact to society are, for instance, investment fraud and romance scams, that type of thing. They are there's a lot of money being lost, and I think. For investment scams, it's people are being tricked, and so that is bad. Romance scams, of course, in addition to sort of stealing the money, it also has an ugly psychological impact on the victims. It's really,
loss of confidence, loss of trust.
Yeah. So that's not good. And then we have an explosion, I think, of all kinds of digital fraud happening and attempts. We've continuous sort of phishing for these bank IDs type of thing, because they are interesting. Of course, there's also reasonably good controls, and so the numbers aren't in the same ranges as these others, but they're growing, which is not acceptable, and so there's work to mitigate that too, and then that's like all fraud, they move like water, path of least resistance. So for a long time ago, they put up fake internet banks. Those are now well protected. It's become difficult, and so they're moving through and they have some of the classics, like especially in December, where everyone's sending and receiving packages.
Right.
Then you have a package.
You track and trace.
And we're blocking your package, and you need to pay this small amount. Those are still there and are always evolving. We've seen, and they're I think so. The trend is that is growing.
Yeah.
And so it's even, I think, with the technology, even with what banks do, with the common effort and sharing in our organization, what government does, what police does. Police has actually they also have their own digital transformation to go through. And so they have been somewhat helpful, but needing to learn a lot. And now they're seeing that they have a job to do, and they're actually prioritizing building up the competence to do something on these levels. So they're also doing more. And even with all that effort, the fraud is still growing.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because where will that end? You might make an argument that as an industry we do so much effort. You build an organization like NFCert. Dozens of people are sitting here just around the corner working on threats every single day, but the problem is still getting bigger. Where will it end?
I do think that, there will be, it can't grow forever. But it will take, and I think especially with the new payment services, I think to find sort of how does this new world look, and then of course in a world with smart fraudsters, smart criminals going the path of least resistance, so you can't. You have to actually create a system that continually adapts, because the threat will, the moment you do something, they will adapt and try to do something. And so you have to think in a way where you can, you don't sort of solve the problem forever. You set up, so you find, and I think that is what's happening now in the Nordic countries, potentially also in the EU. It's who are the stakeholders here? Who can be part of solving this problem? I think the payment providers, they have a job to do, but they can't solve it. I think police have a job to do, but they can't solve it. I think other government and you're from schools, training, awareness, digital, competence in the people. They have a job to do, but they can't solve it. So you actually have everyone with a stake need to collaborate. Yeah, I forgot. So we also have internet providers, so that telco business, they can be part of, they run part of the infrastructure, so they are needed to solve it, type of thing. And of course we also have social media, which can be part of the problem and that need to be part of the solution. And so all of these, I think you actually need to have them work in concert to block this. And in my mind, I think that understanding is starting to, it's shared. And I think the doing what it takes to actually get something done with it, I see elements of it. You have the EU, which I think even and the Nordics is mostly EU connected, even though sort of Finland, Sweden, and Denmark are real EU countries. Iceland and Norway are EEA, so we have a connection, but we're not. We participate in the EU, but we don't get to make the decisions.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's. But in this part, I think the EU financial regulation is quite important. But also some of the others. From GDPR a few years ago that establishes privacy. And you have, I think last year, you have It's not called social media, but it's there's the EU.
The DMA, Digital Markets Act.
No, well, but Digital Services Regulation,
right.
which applies some responsibility to, for instance, social media.
Yeah.
They get, if they want to operate in the EU, they actually have what do you call it, duties. They have things they need to do. They have to collaborate.
Yeah.
And I think those elements are part of what it takes to actually manage to counter this.
Yeah. So if you had a crystal ball, Morten, what would you predict would happen, let's say 1 or 2 years down the road?
I think there's two, and there's a lot of things. I think in the Nordics, digitization, we're happy with it. We're still doing this. That serves us well, and we'll go with it. I think on one level, I think there'll be more actual collaboration between the different stakeholders. There seems to be that seems to be maturing, and so there's an interest and a will, and so I think that will get stronger. I think the other part that might happen is that we start using even more technology to attack this problem.
Right.
And
from a consumer protections perspective, or something else?
Yes, I mean to avoid financial crime. So
right.
It's consumer protection, but it's also protecting society.
Yes.
And so it is. I think that's my impression, and I'm following this. And I mean, we have our thing here. We do our role. I follow it sort of out of interest, but I'm not inside, so I don't know everything. But I think actually using technology, working with more data. I mean, sharing data is one thing. Okay, everyone can have more data and do something. But pooling data and then working on that with a technology head can be quite powerful. And of course, that's a privacy versus interest of society discussion.
Interesting.
So,
what would the lawyers say about that?
Yes, and it varies. I think what I see is that even within the EU, and we have. I mean, I see that in the UK, they can they share more, and they've established. I mean, they also have lawyers and privacy.
True.
And so they've established a situation that where they can do things that we can't currently. And I'm guessing that will come to the EU. But then there's a range in the EU from some of the very privacy-oriented countries on the one side to some of the more flexible ones, and I think we'll have to find a balance. And I believe and I hope that in the Nordics I think again I think then the high trust will serve us, and I think then that will enable us to do this. And but of course with controls.
Yeah.
And in my mind, you can set up a unit, you can have people, you can certify and give them clearances, and they can be specialists and know their role, and then you can let them do a lot of things with data potentially, very simply thought, without having to open up and let anyone do anything with data and sort of lose privacy on the way. I believe, and I think I'm seeing the starts of this happening, that you can do more and keep reasonable privacy.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. Is whereas the sharing was done within the financial industry, but now we tread into a new era where we need to start sharing across multiple industries, finance, governments, big tech, telcos.
Yep.
And there's the opportunity. And in my book, Morten, if anyone wants to learn a little bit about sharing, they might just as well ask you,
Okay.
since you've been doing it for over 10 years right now.
Yeah. We also, I think we learn from others, and so and we're still, it's we've done and tried a few things, but we're definitely on a journey, and I don't think we've cracked it, and so I think we'll have to do next steps, and elements of that solution might already be happening in the UK and the Netherlands, in other parts of the world. We'll see, and I'm not sure if it's not necessarily something that we can invent.
Yeah.
But we can use it, and we can, I think we play on the Nordic culture, that used right, it can be a strength. Yep.
Yeah. I remember 50 years ago, I saw a keynote by a gentleman called Stephen Covey Jr., the son of Stephen Covey, of The Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yep.
His book was The Speed of Trust.
Right.
And what he said might be applicable to the Nordics is that trust is a great asset.
Yep.
But we need smart trust. We don't need dumb or blind trust.
No. So that is, and I think you see it in many places. I think for instance, in the sort of regulated financial products, the exchanges, when they transact, I think they often create a quite high trust environment, and then it's possible to do things in speed. But of course, you have to have ironclad agreements. You have to have. I mean, you can't have room for stepping outside and misusing.
Yeah.
So it has to be with control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on that note, I want to thank you that you're hosting me today. It was very insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me on your podcast.
Yeah. And my name is Eward Driehuis for Threat Fabric. If you want to see more episodes of Fusion Fireside, go to www.threatfabric.com.